a number of people did confirm they saw this, particularly at the coroner's office after a body was taken in for autopsy. And the people who've spoken out on this all said that within like 48 hours, the diary had mysteriously vanished or had been confiscated. So that part of the story, it's pretty safe in saying that, you know, the existence of the journal it can be vindicated. And Dorothy Kilgallen's interest in crashed UFOs can be vindicated as well, 7 years before she was speaking to Marilyn Monroe. Now, of course, the document itself hasn't been vindicated. It's still, you know, in that questionable grey area, so to speak. In terms of when you add it to the rest of the story, you know, it does kind of add weight to it as well, I think.
Tell us who Pat Price was, the kinds of stuff that he did with his abilities, and then what happened to him.
Well, yeah, I mean, Pat Price was one of the most respected so-called remote viewers, or psychic spies, if you like, in the 1970s. The 70s was the one era, I guess, more than any other, when remote viewing really came to the fore. The idea of using the power of the human mind, psychic phenomena, to spy on potential enemies like the Russians or the Chinese. And as I said, Pat Price was at the forefront of this. Interestingly, one of the things that Pat Price reportedly remote viewed were a number of underground installations where very human-like aliens existed. And he talked about Mount Zeal in Australia, another one in the Pyrenees Mountains, somewhere on the border of France and Spain.
One in Alaska?
Yeah, one also in Alaska. So in other words, reportedly all around the world. Now, the most controversial aspect of Pat Price's life, ironically, is possibly his death. This gets into sort of very weird areas. It actually occurred in Las Vegas. He checked into the Stardust Hotel, and several weird things happened. He mentioned to friends that just the previous evening, when he was in Washington, D.C., prior to flying out to Las Vegas, that somebody slipped something into his cup of coffee. Fortunately, he actually saw the person doing this, and so he didn't drink the coffee. Now, when he got to the hotel, he actually collided with another man in the lobby, and he didn't really give that much thought at that particular time. But in the early hours late that night, he started to feel ill, and in the early hours of the morning, he got sicker and sicker, and it was actually on that day that he died, and it was actually put down to heart disease. Now, one of the things I point out is that the whole issue of this guy colliding with Price in the hotel lobby and then Price falling sick afterwards is actually eerily similar to something that happened in England, where I grew up, back in 1978, involving a man named Georgi Markov, who actually defected. Excuse me, he was a defector from Bulgaria, and what happened was that he was actually stabbed in the back of the leg by someone with an umbrella, and it was actually put down to an accident at the time. But it was found on his autopsy when he died that Markov had actually been stabbed with a fatal poison. And this sounds very similar potentially to this situation with Pat Price, that it almost sounds like two attempts were made on his life, one with somebody slipping something into the coffee, which didn't work, and then possibly with this collision in the lobby that's only hours later then he began to fall sick. And, you know, it's a very, very strange story that sounds like somebody wanted to get rid of him.
When you hear him say, as a remote viewer, I psychically see alien bases under a couple of mountains, it sounds pretty wacky. But we should point out that he had uncovered stuff that he wasn't supposed to know. I mean, he discovered they had tasked him to look for one thing, and he found something else, secret NSA facilities. And when NSA or CIA or both found out that he knew about them, they were very upset.
Yeah, they were. I mean, on the one hand, this, you know, demonstrates his skills. But I think, on the other hand, you're quite right that no one really anticipated the sheer extent of his ability to sort of psychically penetrate not just overseas facilities, but classified internal facilities as well. I think because he was perceived as arguably the leading remote viewer of the time, it's not surprising that someone would have wanted to get rid of him. Now, one of the more controversial theories is that, he was actually assassinated by extraterrestrials purely and simply because he'd uncovered this sort of network of underground installations, not just sort of in the US, but around the entire planet. And, you could make a good argument, or you could ask the question, had he not been killed, how much further would he have gone with this remote viewing investigation of potential underground installations with a UFO connection? Maybe that had something to do with his death.
I would think the KGB would have wanted him dead. If they somehow found out about his abilities, they would have wanted him dead for sure. And I'm not sure, he might have been too much of a threat for CIA and NSA, figuring, gosh, a guy like that, who knows what beans he might spill.
Well, yeah, the KGB is actually a good candidate because I mentioned the death of Georgy Markov in 1978 in London. Well, that was supposedly done, as I said, by the Bulgarian secret police. However, they worked very closely with the Soviet KGB, and there have been stories that it could have been like a joint operation. So, this was just 3 years after Pat Price, 75 to 78. So, I think the Soviets could be a good candidate as well.
I wanted to touch on the guy, the MK Ultra guy, if you can tell that story.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a guy named Frank Olson who fell to his death or was pushed, very similar fashion to that of James Forrestal in 1959. And Frank Olson was someone who was heavily involved in the early 50s in the MK Ultra program of sort of mind manipulation and mind control, as it's become sort of popularly known. And the reason I mention this in the book is because over the years there have been various allegations that some UFO events may have been sort of staged events to try and determine how far the mind can really be manipulated by seeing if people can sort of fall for fake UFO events. Now, the important thing I should stress is this doesn't mean there aren't real UFOs. There clearly are. But the idea is that, sort of LSD and mind-altering drugs are being used to try and stage UFO events and see how far they can go. But Frank Olson was someone who was heavily involved with both the military and the intelligence community in terms of, new concepts and so forth in mind control. And the story is sort of highly controversial, mainly because of his death, which occurred in 1953, in November 1953, when he actually fell from the Manhattan Statler Hotel from the 10th floor and, like Forrestal, died. Now, there are actually a number of key events that link Olson with the UFO phenomenon. For example, one of the most intriguing ones is that some of the operations that he was involved in occurred at a place called Horn Island in Mississippi. This was actually only a couple of miles, and this was a mind-altering chemical weaponry was tested. One of them, a drug called BZ, which could have sort of bizarre and graphic hallucinogenic effects on people. This actually, the place where this was undertaken was literally only a couple of miles from where one of the most famous abduction events occurred in the early 70s, involving Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker at a place called Pascagoula, where they underwent a very strange abduction experience. But when we find that BZ was actually being tested just literally down the road from there, that kind of makes me wonder if there was a tie-in with that particular case as well.
I'll tell you, Nick, we'll take a break. We'll continue our conversation, and then we'll open up the phone lines with questions. I know there are a lot of them from our listeners. Nick, I wanted to give you a chance to wrap up the story about the MK Ultra guy.
Frank Olson, who was one of the major players in the MK Ultra mind control, mind manipulation project that kicked off in the early 1950s. And as I said before the break, Olson was someone who mixed with people in the UFO field almost as easily as he did people in the mind control angle as well. Now, as I talked about before the break, the controversial theory is that some UFO events may have been fabricated using sort of mind-altering technologies born out of MK Ultra. And as I said, the significant thing is that Olson was actually linked with various people in the UFO subject. Now, one of them was a man named Andrija Puharic, who was someone who was actually an American of Yugoslavian descent and who claimed to have been contacted by extraterrestrials. And he had something called the Round Table Foundation in Glen Cove, Maine. But Puharic was actually also a captain in the U.S. Army at the Edgewood, Maryland-based Army Chemical Center, where a lot of the MK-Ultra research was carried out.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but he was also a played a major role in the Uri Geller story.
Exactly. And Frank Olson met with Puharic on a number of occasions to discuss his work in the field of chemical technology in terms of mind manipulation and the UFO subject as well. And there's another story about how in 1954 there was a wave of very strange UFO sightings in France. It coincides with the fact that just a couple of years earlier, Frank Olson had been in that very area of France discussing with French intelligence agents how the mind could be manipulated and altered, because the French government was interested in this as well. And then it's kind of intriguing. We have this outbreak of UFO activity in that very same area. So we have a lot of things like this. As I point out, before the break, if people who might not have heard it, the Pascagoula case of 1973 involving two men in an abduction, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Their experience occurred just a couple of miles from a place where BZ, a highly hallucinogenic substance, was tested. So we have, again, strands of what I think potentially could turn out to be a much bigger story.
In that same vein, I remember reading about this string of scientific deaths, Marconi Electric Systems. In fact, it might be more than one company associated with a string of deaths, but this is the one that you mentioned.
Well, they're all good questions. It all goes back to the early 1980s when President Ronald Reagan, envisaged the whole Strategic Defense Initiative program, as he called it, or SDI, or as it was more famously known, Star Wars. And the idea was, it was a very grand and ambitious program where we would have like a huge laser-based armada orbiting in near-Earth orbit. So in the event that the Russians or the Chinese launched a sneak nuclear attack, these laser-based weapons could actually just obliterate and blast out of the sky, disintegrate any potential nuclear weapons launched by somebody else at the US. Now, the program, as I said, was a very grand and visionary one, but it may not have sort of reached the potential that the president perceived that potentially it could. Now, this coincided with Reagan making a number of public statements on the UFO subject and talking about how if there was some sort of alien invasion, it would unite us as a species. And you can find many of these lectures online. They're actually filmed, and he does make these comments on a number of occasions. Clearly, to me, it seems like he was trying to get the word out, so to speak. Well, bear in mind the SDI work and Reagan talking about hostile aliens. Marconi, an English company that it's now actually incorporated into another company today, but does a lot of high-level work for the British Ministry of Defence and the British Royal Air Force, the military, etc., on weapon systems and things like that. Marconi was actually contracted to work extensively on the SDI program from varying different disciplines. And what's intriguing is that between 1982 and 1991, no less than 31 scientists and personnel working for Marconi, many on the SDI angles, died under mysterious circumstances. And by mysterious circumstances, I mean out-of-the-blue suicides, jumping off bridges, car crashes where, in one case, for example, a man just had normal life and then just one day just loaded the trunk of his car with gasoline tanks, hit the highway, and slammed into a deserted cafe at like 80 miles an hour and just blew himself up. Another one put a rope around his neck, tied the other end around a lamppost, got in his car and hit the accelerator and decapitated himself.